Depth of field is not only a technical issue, it is also an important storytelling tool. Several things affect depth of field. First is aperture. The more wide open the iris, the less depth of field you will have. Here the lens is wide open. On this lens, that's f1.9. As we close down to a smaller aperture, we get more depth of field. Here the lens is at minimum f-stop. On this lens, that's f22. As we open up again, we reduce the depth of field. Format also affects depth of field. The smaller the film gate or sensor size, the more depth of field you will have. Focal length also affects depth of field. The longer the focal length, the less depth of field you will have. As we zoom out to a wider focal length, we increase depth of field. Focus distance is also a factor. When the camera is very close to the subject, depth of field will be minimal. Here, with nothing else changing, moving the camera farther away increases depth of field. Field of view is a measure of how wide a picture a lens takes. The smaller the focal length, the wider the field of view will be. Here we are starting with a fairly wide 25mm prime lens. As we go up in focal length, the field of view becomes progressively more narrow. Increasing focal length also results in a higher degree of magnification. The waveform monitor is one of your most important tools in video. It measures brightness levels in different areas of the scene. Here we're going to look at a standard 11-step grayscale on the waveform monitor as we increase and decrease exposure. As we overexpose the scene, it clips out. It flatlines at the top, and we lose all separation between the steps of the grayscale. The picture is completely blown out. As we decrease exposure, everything crushes together at the bottom. Again, we lose all separation between the steps of the grayscale. Now here's the same test with the CamBells, a standard test chart. As we decrease exposure, again, everything crushes together at the bottom. With normal exposure, we get a full range of tones and good separation between the values of the scene. Underexposure doesn't only make it darker, it destroys the separation of tones that existed in the original scene. This is why there's so much more to exposure than just it's too light or too dark. Only with proper exposure does the video truly represent all the original tone values of the scene and the full range of tones from dark to light. Latitude is a measure of what range of brightness values a film stock or video camera can represent. This is a latitude test of a typical high-def camera. The background subject will remain constant in exposure as a comparison. The foreground actor will change exposure in half-stop increments. Pay attention to skin tone, separation in the grayscale, how much detail you can see, and also color saturation. Here at one stop under, the foreground actor is noticeably darker. You can fix some degree of over or under exposure in post, but it is never going to be as good as if you had exposed it properly in the first place. Trying to fix an underexposed image will usually result in more noise and other problems. Now at 1 1/2 stops under, we can see that she is definitely underexposed. We are losing separation and detail in the shadows. We could probably bring it up in post, but then the background actor would be too hot. It is important to think of exposure in two ways. One is overall exposure, the other is exposure balance within the scene. Even at -2 stops, we can still see some detail in the skin tone. Also, color saturation is falling off rapidly. At -2 1/2 stops, Clearly, this image is unsalvageable. However, it is remarkable how much high-def sees into the shadows. It really has a high tolerance for underexposure, even to the point where it can sometimes be a problem if you want a part of the scene to go very dark. Clearly, if the actress were the main subject in this frame, it would be a grossly underexposed image. But what if we needed her to go dark? For example, maybe she is hiding in the shadows, and the director wants her to be visible, but only barely so. How much detail would we want to see? This is another reason latitude tests like this are so important. In comparison to film, at 4 stops underexposed, it is amazing that we can see any detail at all. It is important to know the limits of your camera or film stock at both ends. Now back to normal, both foreground and background at equal exposure. At just 1/2 stop over, we are already starting to see problems with her skin tone. It's starting to look a little bleached out. At 1 stop over, I would consider this an unacceptable image. It probably couldn't be saved in post. The skin tones are starting to look bleached out and clipped, and this is at only 1 stop overexposed. At 1 1/2 stops over, we are seeing the opposite of what we saw before. While high-def has excellent latitude on the underexposure side, it has surprisingly little tolerance for overexposure. At 2 stops over, there's no way this image could be saved. The highlights are clipped, separation is lost on the grayscale, the detail is gone in the lighter areas, and color saturation has suffered badly. At 2 1/2 stops, this could never be a usable image. Remember that you have to think of exposure in 2 ways, both as the overall exposure of the scene, which is set by the lens aperture, and relative exposure within the scene, how light or dark different parts of the scene are in relation to each other. Latitude tests like this one will help you judge both kinds of exposure. ISO, or what used to be called ASA, is how we measure how sensitive a film stock or video camera is to light. The lower the ISO, the less sensitive it is, but it also usually means the image quality will be better. A higher ISO means you can shoot in darker conditions, which is obviously an advantage, but there is always a price to be paid. In general, the higher the ISO, the more video noise there will be in the video picture. In film, a higher ISO means more film grain. In both cases, there is an overall loss of image quality. Film grain is often used as a part of the look of film, especially for scenes that require a vintage look. One thing that some people try is to increase video noise and then try to convince themselves that it looks like film grain. It doesn't. If you want to add a film grain look to high-def video, it is much better done in post. This test was done with a red camera, and it delivers a remarkable image at even fairly high ISO. There is increased noise, but not nearly as much as one might expect. In general, both film stocks and high-def cameras are constantly getting better at delivering high-quality images, even at very high ISOs.